Good morning. Well, I'm quite impressed actually. So we are here with an idea. I know the festival is called FODA, Festival of Ideas, of Food Ideas, and this is something we have been talking about for a long time and tried to activate. So it's really lovely to kind of get it done. And we just us four just had a conversation outside. Just to check we know what we're talking about, and I thought I'd do the intro because this is the very first panel of this festival, and I'm sure some of you were in the room on Friday night when we did the launch, but for me this is the cornerstone of what we're trying to achieve from my point of view. Yes, outside once we finish this conversation, there's going to be the pony farm bus will be active, and hopefully kids' workshops will be taking place, rolling pizza, rolling pasta, and that happened yesterday. They were fully booked every day, all day, which is lovely. Hopefully the sun will come out and the farmers market or the producers market will be active. So there's many different factors to this festival, and I think that's really important to create accessibility points for all walks of life to engage. But really, why we're here is that a couple of years ago, when the Pony and Trap changed into the Pony Chew Valley, and 6 months later, after opening, we opened the cookery school, which is on the first floor. I deliver quite a lot of the cookery classes in the school, and the school is for the general public. We deliver corporate classes. We're training chefs from all over the country now, which is great. And we have a huge community base there, so we have a lot of local schools coming in, and that's part of our community outreach, and we'll walk school classes around the garden to pick herbs and identify herbs and make a pesto, and that's all part of our community outreach, and the next stage of that is the pony farm bus, which is outside on the quay, so for us to take those ideas to places in Bristol that can't necessarily come to us. What I'm getting to is that having conversations in the cookery school with 10 individuals has inspired me to potentially create what we're doing now. Some of the conversations we have around cooking are not entirely that complicated, and I've noticed that the classes that I deliver, for me, I'd like to focus on simple ideas and technique. And one of them is salt, and how to use what salt to use, when to season things, and then there's a lot of health questions around that. So that's really inspired the whole of this festival, to get this symposium going and to ask questions and to try and create educational pieces and create learning opportunities for all individuals. So that's why I'm here. And that's, I feel like I've already learned a load of stuff with our little chat outside, actually. So I'm just going to let these guys introduce themselves individually, tell us what their perspective is and who they are, where they've come from. It's really interesting, and then we're going to have a conversation, and then we'll move into some questions. And I think for the questions we can do a mic, or if you like, there'll be some tabs that come around that you can write a question down and just send it forward, and we can have a chat about that. Good. Shall I hand over to you?
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm Ash Ranpura. I'm a neurologist and a neuroscientist. For me, salt plays a massive role in brain function. It's probably the most important thing there could possibly be about neural function. So I'll talk more about that.
Hello, I'm Gurdeep Loyal. I am a food and travel writer, and my writing primarily is about demystifying flavour for home cooks. And ultimately, I want home cooks to feel as empowered as chefs are in their kitchens, and salt is, I think, one of the most fundamental things about sort of bringing out flavours in food that home cooks have kind of misconceptions about or don't fully understand. And so for me, where I'm coming from is very much from a place of home cooks being able to experience the maximum joy of flavour, and that's what I'm going to talk about, with salt being the alchemy that does that.
Okay. And my name is Philip Tanswell. I'm the managing director of Cornish Sea Salt, and sort of fondly known as the Salt Geek. I come from an engineering background, and for us at Cornish Sea Salt, it was really understanding the process. So I came in right at the beginning to get the company operational, and very quickly we learned that there was different ways of manufacturing salt and different ways of making salt, which had an effect on the taste and flavour. And so, since my job over the years is really to be understanding the brines, the processes, So the actual, because I mean, salts, there's depending on who you talk to, there's either 82, 96 or 104 different sorts of compounds which could be made up and called salts, so negative and positive charged ions, salts, metals and acids. And what we do at Cornish Sea Salt is really understanding what's in the sea and trying to get that onto the sea salt crystals you buy, so that the flavour and profile, and we'll talk more about this later on, but the different salts, the different electrolytes, and we're going to have a salt taste later on, so you can actually taste the difference, because really rarely you do these things, between pure sodium chloride, which is most products you'll buy, even if you're buying sea salts, and a really good sea salt. There are other sea salts available. Obviously, I'm talking about the brand, but there are other good sea salts out there. But we'll really give you that difference between why there's good salts and why there's bad salts. So I'll sort of try and do that sort of, in a sense, that sort of the salt engineer, if you like, in the background, and explain that from that.
What I think we mean by this, a salt in medicine is really similar to what you were talking about, which is this, it's an ionic compound. So it's made of two charged particles. It's got a positive particle and a negative particle. And when they're together without water, when it's dry, it forms a crystal. So it's a solid. But in the body, of course, it's wet, because the body is mostly filled with water. And so when salt is in water, it floats around as this positive charge and negative charge. And the brain, neurons in the brain, as you all probably know, they work on the basis of electricity. So you have this weird situation where you have to have electrical currents in a bath of water, which is an absolute disaster for electricity. So you have to have a way of channeling electrical currents through this bath of salt water. And the way that the brain does that is it uses fat. So it uses fat as a kind of barrier. And those fat barriers keep the positive ions and the negative ions from the salt separated. And the body uses active processes to move these ions around so that they can stay separated. But the basic way that any neuron in any animal works, and in our brain, the way the neurons work, is it's a little bit like, like those old mouse traps that spring close? So to arm the mouse trap, you pull back the mouse trap and you pull down a clip, right? And it locks in this potential. So that's what the brain does. It basically moves some of the salt, like the sodium ions to one side, potassium ions to the other side, and that creates an electrical potential, and that's like the trap is armed. And then the brain can release that trap. So when it flips the switch, all the ions switch places, and that acts like an electrical current. And that can keep going down the length of a neuron, so you get these switches that flip and flip and flip. What's kind of interesting, and this was something we talked about at the beginning, if a lot of times people talk about, or they ask me particularly, well, could you have a brain in a jar? Could we recreate consciousness if we could recreate every electrical current in the body? And the answer to that is no, because by the time you have an electrical current in a neuron, the traps have been sprung, the salt has moved. Right. But if you could recreate the molecular state of the salt, you could recreate consciousness. That would be the thing that ultimately was what we were. It was that potential state before the traps are released, when the salt is all in place. Before that moment, that is actually the state of the brain. And I think
that a brain over there?
Yeah. Right. But isn't it interesting? I mean, it's like the thing that most defines us, that I think we think the least about. I mean, we think about electricity, we think about blood, we think about oxygen, these kind of glucose.
But
it's salt. It really is salt.
And the other term, the electrolytes, which also people are familiar with, is another way of describing a salt, or those two potential negative positive charge ions.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Again, just that when people thinking about electrolytes, that's what they are. It's the negative positive charge
and
ions.
electrolytes are talked about a lot at the moment.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that? But because you can get bottles of water that are charged, I don't know, with electrolytes in it.
Yeah.
I mean, is it a fad, or is it?
It is, to a point, it's a fad. I think the majority of people consume enough electrolytes in their diet that actually they don't need to take on more products. I mean, you can become electrolyte deficient, as you're saying, that your brain stops working. So but the majority of time, the food you're producing, the land is built on rock. The rock has minerals or electrolytes or salts in, which get taken into the plants and animals. So you do consume all the time salt. Yeah. So if you have poor soils, so if you're hydroponics or something, you're producing that side, you can be salt deficient from that side. But the majority of the time, most people will not need salt in their diet. And there are a few caveats on that. Firstly is if they do extreme exercise. So if you're somebody who is an elite athlete, and you're exercising for a long period of time, then actually you may well need to take electrolytes back in. And of course, what's an extreme athlete? I can't define that. And the other thing is, if you're genetically disposed to sweating a lot of salt in your sweat or for your urine. So actually the amount of salt you excrete from your bodies is quite extreme. Because and we'll talk, I'm sure, a lot about this, about the health side. So like many things in life, society tries to blanket an amount of salt we produce. But actually the amount of salt each person needs is completely different. So depending on who you are, what you excrete, how much you take in, and there's not only my WI talk, there's also a long talk about the genetics and where you came from and where you, basically where we came from in society. The short answer is probably not. You probably don't need those electrolyte drinks,
Right.
But some people will. Some people will for high performance. I mean, I have 3 boys who all play rugby to quite a high standard, and they all take a lot of electrolyte drinks, and they also sweat a lot. So. Which is, So
I have a much less healthy family. and I'll tell you when you really need an electrolyte drink is if you're really hungover.
Yeah, well, we had
Other situations.
Yeah, well, we had a very nice evening last night.
That's why I'm asking, because I do that.
I know. It's because of all your rugby, Josh. Yeah. No, but it is interesting. So with the hangover, and actually, I mean, there's a low salt state that is so. For people who take MDMA or ecstasy.
Yeah.
So one of the things that happens when you take ecstasy, MDMA, Molly,
We're just doing tomatoes here, by the way.
it's fine. It goes on late into the evening though, this thing, right? And you guys were all out last night. So what happens when you take ecstasy is that it has this weird effect called SIADH. So it's a syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone. And what that complicated thing means is it stops you from peeing. So if you can't pee and you're drinking lots of water, there's this really important relationship between salt and water in the body. Where salt goes, water goes. Where sodium ions go, water molecules go. So if you can't pee and you're drinking lots of water because you've heard in the newspaper that people on MDMA need to drink lots and you get really thirsty, right? So you're drinking lots of water, then what happens is that functionally your salt in your blood gets really dilute. So although you have the same amount of salt in your body, the brain doesn't see that because it's really dilute. And what can happen then in the extreme case, which actually has recorded instances, are seizures and coma. And that's from a state called hyponatremia. So that's low salt. So there are these weird low salts.
Drowning.
What's that?
Internally drowning.
Yeah, you're sort of internally drowning. I mean, you're flooding yourself. And when the MDMA wears off, suddenly people will need to pee a lot. Their kidneys will reestablish that balance. So it's fine in the long term. But in the short term, you can get into these. And the other state is when you're drinking a lot, because when you're drinking a lot, it causes you to pee a lot. Probably happened last night, I guess.
Well, we did have a big night last night.
I wasn't there. And then when you pee a lot normally and you're not having this SIADH. So with alcohol you're just peeing normally. And then you're losing a lot of salt. And the hangover is there's this new trend of getting these salt injections. So in London, for £200, you can get a nurse that'll hook up an IV and will give you a drip of salt water.
Oh my God.
The other way to do that is just drink salt water. But it's a lot cheaper. But it really helps the hangover. It really does help.
Well, you don't. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? The body is trying to regulate its sort of ion content of the blood, and one of the issues is if you have become dehydrated, but you've also lost a lot of salt, it's very hard for you to take the water back on board.
Absolutely.
Because your body says, actually, I don't want to absorb that water because it's going to make my salt situation even worse. Because again, the brain is a really useful thing to keep functioning, as well as all the other things in your body. So one of the reasons why you would take, going back to the point, you'd have salt and ideally potassium, so you'd have sodium and potassium in there, because the sodium-potassium pump, which again is this mechanism of how you actually absorb water in. So if you don't have enough of the electrolytes within your body, you're effectively what your system will say is, I'm not taking any more water in, because actually it's going to make my electrolyte issue even worse.
Exactly.
So that's why you don't absorb it. So that's why, again, hangovers, sport, there is an argument for it, but again, it's whether it's enough in normal society without going to Roots in the evening, whether it's enough to warrant having a drink with caffeine and salt and all the other bits and pieces, which is good marketing, I think.
Yeah.
Spit a little bit of salt in a glass of water from your salt tub in the morning.
But
that's all you need.
Importantly, good salt in that glass of water.
Good salt. Yeah.
So, I mean, we've got two things here, haven't we? We're heavily touching on health, and that is important. We've established that we all need salt in our diet. The popular opinion is that we all have too much salt, but I think we're all having ultra-processed foods, and too much of the wrong salt. So right now, what we have a health conversation, but for me, that health conversation is intrinsically linked into making delicious food, being able to understand how to make delicious food, but also be healthy. And that's something that we've been talking a lot about in the cookery school, and that's something that you're...
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think from a sort of cook's perspective, there's quite a few sort of analogies and metaphors that get used about salt that I really like, and they're actually quite useful, I think, sometimes. One is the idea that salt is what gives food its own personality and makes it taste like itself. That's, if you don't salt your food, you're denying your food its identity. And, we're in a world where everyone is very proud of their identity, so it's important to salt your food. Another metaphor I really like is that salt is the difference between cooking in 2D and 3D. Salt literally gives your food that sort of dimension. Another metaphor that I really like is the idea that cooking without salt is almost like cooking with your tongue dipped in wax. You're getting the sensation, you're eating, but you're not actually getting those receptors kind of triggering. So, salt has all sorts of interesting kind of impacts. For me, when it comes to salt, I think my biggest sort of bit of advice to home cooks always is, one, to use good salt, and two, to season as you go. It is the biggest difference, I think, between good cooking and exceptional cooking, and is the biggest difference between chefs and home cooks.
Season and taste, as you
Season
go.
and taste, exactly.
Yeah.
So one of the problems I think that home cooks often have is they don't taste as they go, and they don't season as they go, and then they get a spaghetti bolognese, and at the end, it doesn't taste of anything. They grab the table salt, which I'll let you talk much more about, and they smother their food in that table salt, adding a lot more to try and give it some dimension, effectively. If, however, you're seasoning as you go, and a prime example, and it's the first thing you do in so many recipes, is frying some onions. The best thing to do to fry those onions and to add that first dimension of salt is to add a bit of salt, because the salt will draw out the water.
Yeah.
And so much of cooking is ultimately about trying to get rid of the water. And then taste and season as you go, as you add the meat. Add a little bit of salt, add good salt, and then when you get to the end, it shouldn't need any salt. And that, for me, is sort of the thing. Salt gives that dimension. It also has lots of other impacts. It reduces astringency. It amplifies the effects of sugar, and I think we all know there are sort of 5 taste buds: as sweet, salty, bitter, umami. What have I missed? Sleepy, dopey, and sour.
Yes.
Anyway, there's actually another one which I find quite interesting, which is not a taste, but it's a sensation, which is called kokumi. Have you heard of kokumi?
No.
Kokumi is interesting. So kokumi is an extension of umami. Umami is very much savouriness.
Like Parmesan.
Parmesan, yes.
Yeah.
Kokumi is actually much more about depth of flavour and length of flavour and satisfyingness. It's really interesting. It's something that's sort of been discovered in Japan about 20 years ago. It's definitely not another sense. It's not another taste, but it is a sensation.
So almost longevity on the palate. Longevity
length,
on the palate.
Depth of flavour.
I know exactly what you mean, yeah.
Yeah, there are some ingredients.
Umami is more rounded.
Umami is
and then-
rounded savouriness, and it's length. So you can get it through things like black garlic, aged miso, very aged cheeses. And interestingly, salt is one of the things that amplifies kokumi in particular. And kokumi is increasingly being linked to feeling satisfied. And I think often when people talk about salt and vilify salt, it is because, yes, people eat too much bad table salt and bad salt in processed food because they're not seasoning as they go with good salt, and therefore they're not feeling satisfied. And that, for me, I think
maybe
is
because it's
often my
mixed in
biggest
with,
advice.
in ultra-processed foods,
Yes,
it's always mixed in heavily with sugar.
exactly.
You know, and actually, when you cook, I think that a lot of people, if something tastes so salty, they immediately go for the sugar.
Yeah.
Which is what you shouldn't really do. So on the palate, salt sits opposite bitterness, really. If you have something that's incredibly bitter, if you salt that will reduce. You might be able to help me with this. That will reduce bitterness. But I've heard something recently that actually salt just stops bitterness from it kind of it's like a communication blocker rather than reducing it.
Right.
By way of giving an example, chicory, incredibly bitter chicory. If you cut a piece of chicory in half, caramelize it in the pan with some oil, maybe a bit of butter. If you then glaze that in soy sauce and eat it, it will not taste salty of soy sauce, and it will also not taste bitter. So chicory glazed in soy is absolutely delicious, and that's the best example I can come up with about how those two things sit opposite on the palate. But
Can I make a comment on that? Because that's exactly mechanistically what happens in the brain.
Right.
Salt does two interesting things on the palate. So first of all, salt, because salt, what we taste as clean salt, and you can talk more about that, but just sodium chloride. The neurons' electrical impulses work basically on the movement of sodium and potassium and chlorine. These are the three ions that matter the most. Magnesium matters a little bit, but really it's sodium, chlorine, and potassium. So when you eat salt, that's directly activating the neurons in your tongue. Right. When you eat glucose, that is indirectly. That has to act through sodium, chlorine, and potassium to cause a signal. So the reason that salt is such a powerful flavor enhancer is because it's directly adding to neural signaling, absolutely immediately. Without salt, you would never taste sugar. You couldn't.
Yeah. So
if you had no salt in your tongue at all, you could never taste anything. So none of the neurons could be active.
Communication.
Yeah, so it's the actual message. You know, the taste of sugar is turned into a salt-based message, and that message goes to the brain, whereas salt is directly going to the brain.
Is that what makes salted caramel so extremely pleasurable then?
Well, it's interesting. So this is the thing.
What is the science behind caramel?
Yeah, so I was just thinking with chicory, my mother, who grew up in South India, they use a lot of chicory in their coffee, and my mom adds a little bit of salt to the coffee because salt cuts the bitterness of coffee.
Yeah.
Just like salt on dark chocolate, it cuts the bitterness.
And salt in Coca-Cola.
Salt and Coca-Cola. So anything that's bitter, if you put salt to it, it brings the sweetness forward.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is there's direct suppression. When you put salt on the tongue, there's direct suppression of the bitter taste receptor that you mentioned. Right. And then in the brain, exactly as you said, when you activate the salt taste parts of the brain get activated so much more strongly than the bitter components that it drowns out the bitter signal.
Okay.
So it's first of all that you're perceiving the bitter less on the tongue, but also your brain is reacting to the bitter sensation less.
Can I just talk on that sort of mechanism there? Because the salts, the way you taste it, going back to salts, negative, positive charge ions. So they, in a sense, they're electrical pathways which allow information to be transmitted across them. So your saliva is basically just under 1% saline. So if your saliva was just pure water, you wouldn't taste.
Yes,
because you wouldn't get the contact across. What happens when you add salt to a food is once it's broken, once those ionic bonds are broken across and you have the electrolytes or ions which are transmitting, those ions then create potential more electrical pathways between the food and your taste buds. So in a sense, you're turning up the sound, you're amplifying that sound. And going back to good and bad salts, you have what happens with, if you like, with pure sodium chloride, is you get this very sort of distinct separation between the food and the salt. A really good salt, where you have, which are the main components of the chlorides is sodium, magnesium, potassium and calcium, you get this sort of rich balance where you actually drive the flavour of the food forward. And you have a very different experience. But again, after the talk, we'll do a demonstration just with pure sodium chloride and table salt, so you can actually just taste the difference. Because often you just think, well, salt is a conductor, it'll do the same. But again, those different neurons, those different receptors have different information. And most of taste is to do with physical contact. There is, I think, some emotional stuff. I remember that bottle of wine you have, sitting in some amazing park. I mean, we had our first son was born, and it's, a perfect location, and you strive to find that same glass of wine for years and years and years. And I've done a lot of striving, but you never quite get there again. But again, it's that sort of emotional.
We talked about this, about memory forming.
Yeah.
And how you need to experience everything at least once to form a memory to enjoy it the same way again.
Exactly. And I think quite a lot of flavor perception has to do with your expectation of what that flavor is going to be, either because of the memory or because of the visual appeal or because of the association. Someone says to you, this is going to be sweet, and you eat it and you perceive the sweetness.
Yeah, so it's a combination of all of those things. So a blind tasting of something you've never seen before or tasted before would mean that you would know absolutely nothing about it.
But you
didn't understand that product.
But you're going to drive that. Say, if your first experience is with a bad salt, you're going to improve that flavour experience the next time with a good salt. Although you'll have there'll be a memory of what it was. It could taste better with good salts, and that's why people use really good sea salts, is because it has this balance of different minerals in it. So. I think in the wine industry, it's people understand the term terroir. So, you can have a vineyard which has got the geology underneath it, and the geology may change halfway across that vineyard. And basically the food which the vine is taking up, the nutrients and the ions which it's taking up, could be completely different on one side of the field to the other. So the grape will have different flavour.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same with sea salts or with good salts, is that in a sense, rather than terroir, we call it merroir. So it's the flavour of the sea. And you'll get that with shellfish, and you'll get that with seaweeds, depending where you are. Where we're based on the Lizard Peninsula in Cornwall, we have two particular rocks which are unique to that area, which is gabbro and serpentine. Gabbro is really not known about unless you're really into archaeology and you've looked at, watched Time Team or one of these programs, and they find bits of gabbro clay pot. Serpentine is better known because Queen Victoria, after Albert died, a lot of London suddenly became very dark purple blues. But both those rocks are high in magnesium and calcium. And what happens is, so when the planet formed 5.5 billion years ago, whichever it was, whatever date we're going for at the moment, and the waters formed on top, H2O, there was no salt in it. So basically, the water's on there. As the water sloshed around and eroded the rocks, those minerals became exposed and went into the seawater. The nuances you'll get. So I know you said you're good mates for Halloween and stuff.
Yeah.
So nuances you'll get in different waters. So for me, I'm really interested. I'll travel around a little bit and then also be scent salt and the flavours from different natural salts. And what I call a natural salt is a salt that hasn't been washed. So although washing is normally seen as a real positive, in the world of salt, it's a real negative, because what happens when you're crystallising salt is the first thing that, forget the calcium carbonate, which comes out the lime scale, but the next thing is the sodium chloride. Sodium chloride comes through, and then your brines, if they're natural brines, will be full of these other, we said 80, 90, 100 different compounds, potential compounds in there. And the job of a really good salt manufacturer is to make sure those other compounds, which are also important for health and also for flavour, are actually on those crystals. It's like a lamination process on the outside of the crystal. And so many sea salts you buy, they wash the products. They produce what is potentially something which has its own unique flavour.
Yeah.
And then what happens is, because particularly magnesium salts are quite sticky, they wash them afterwards. And so they're left with a pure sodium chloride flakel crystal, which is, as I said to you earlier on, it doesn't matter if it's from Brazil, Cornwall, Essex, Wales,
It's sodium chloride.
Australia, it's sodium chloride. It is
Yeah.
a chemical compound. It has no, we may have an emotional response, I've opened my favourite box of salt, but actually, realistically, it's not giving you those nuances, which is what's so important for flavouring chefs.
One of the things I often say to sort of very early cooks is that sea salt is just the sea dehydrated. That's all it is. I think people get very confused about what it is. And for that reason, when you think about a good sea salt, if it's just the sea dehydrated, there are two things that are going to impact that. One, what sea and where in that sea did you get that water from? And two, how did you dehydrate it? And I think that's exactly sort of what you're sort of explaining, is that to get a delicious, complex, sort of interesting salt that's full of all those other minerals, you want good sea, well dehydrated. And that, for me, is the thing I'm always trying to sort of get across to people. And I'm really intrigued to see what the taste test does. But I think that's sort of the thing around demystifying it. And then table salt has all these other things added, sort of like caking agents and things, which again you'll be able to speak much more about allowing it to free pour and all this sort of stuff. And
They're added in the process. So basically,
Right.
Table salt tends to be a byproduct of the chemical industry. So what happens is, because and they tend to come from rock salts, although you can get arguably table salts from sea salts as well. They go through a process to basically take off all these other magnesium, potassium, calcium, iodine, boron, all these other sort of elements. And the byproducts they have, bearing in mind that 84% of it probably will be sodium chloride, that is then bleached, has anti-caking agents, free-flowing agents in there, and sold back to us as basically as a low-cost flavour enhancer. Going back to the point is, though, it's very much like tasting. I like the analogy of like sound. It's like tasting in mono. So you get this sort of very dull flavour. It's also missing all those other electrolytes which are important for health. Balance again, sodium, potassium again, all these different balancing through. But basically, you don't get that same nuances. Where if you have a really good sea salt, and I always talk about sodium, magnesium, potassium, calcium, it's like having this quadraphonic flavour taste, so it changes. I mean, we were at a food festival a couple of weekends ago, and they were talking about one of our competition, and they were saying it's really interesting because the flavour is just there, whereas in yours it's there, and there. And you get
It's very unique.
and you get this different range. And Cornish sea salt is unique, but there are other also really good other unique salts out there. So it's just, there are, if you leave what's in the sea and you dehydrate it properly, leave on the sea on the crystal, that only
From a good bit of sea.
From a good bit of sea. I mean, there was a study which the BBC put out in 2019, which was really around actually looking at the negative effect of salt. And they very clearly demonstrated that globally, around areas where there was very high salt intake, they saw early death to heart disease, etc. The bit I really picked up on was the areas which have the highest intake of salts happen to be natural sea salts, actually had the longest lives with the least heart attacks. So if you took that as it's a snapshot, so you can't say that's the only function. But if you say, okay, well, just because again, it goes to the function of blood pressure, which I'm sure we'll talk about more about. But if you don't have the balance of sodium and potassium within your blood, your hydration is good. So sodium, really simple way of thinking about it. Sodium increases blood pressure, potassium decreases it. So you have the two together, they balance. If you have one or the other, you're in for problems. If too much one or the other. Potassium is arguably worse than sodium because you're used to taking large amounts of sodium, whereas in potassium you're not used to taking. So there are products out there. The good thing about potassium chloride is it actually tastes foul. So it's not something which, once you've gone, okay, I should be reducing my salt content. Once you've tasted potassium chloride, you go, oh God, that's awful. So a really good balanced sea salt, which has all those different electrolytes, is not only going to improve flavour or make the flavour interesting, unique to the product, it also is healthier because it has those balance of minerals in.
There is one weird situation in which potassium tastes really good. So bananas are incredibly high in potassium. And it is actually possible to stop your heart by eating too many bananas.
Really?
It's really weird. It's one of those weird things we learned in medical school. Well, if you don't drink any water and you eat loads and loads of bananas, you actually get 1 millimole per inch of banana. So it's actually was very, very high in potassium food. And normally you could never, normally if you ate that many bananas, you would just have incredible diarrhea. So it wouldn't be a problem. And actually that's how you would get rid of loads of potassium really quickly. I mean, one of the problems with diarrhea is that we lose loads of electrolytes really, really quickly because we bypass the kidneys. But this thing, I do want to address this thing about like high blood pressure and salt. Because I think when I was growing up, I mean, I don't hear this so much anymore. I don't know if you guys have heard this a lot. When I was growing up, this was a really big concern. You can't have a high salt diet because of high blood pressure. So the mechanism for that is that basically, as you say, like and specifically talking about sodium chloride, table salt, that water goes where sodium goes. So if you have loads of sodium in your blood, your kidneys will retain loads of water in the blood to sort of keep the concentration of salt the same. So more salt means you need more water to keep the same concentration. And more water in the blood means more blood volume, and that means more blood pressure. And it's basically that simple. The more blood volume you have, the more blood pressure. The more blood volume you've got, the more the heart has to work to move that blood around your body against resistance and against pressure. But generally speaking, the kidney is really good at maintaining this. So if you have a lot of salt in your blood, the kidney will excrete salt and water in the urine, and it will maintain the balance really well. There are some people who are generally have a higher salt tolerance than others. There's definitely genetic variation in that. And the other thing is that if you have, I guess, the wrong kind of salt, if you have these highly processed foods where the salt is integrated into the food, but you don't really taste saltiness, so it sort of bypasses your ability to regulate your salt intake. If you have that kind of a diet for a long time, essentially the kidneys will become dysfunctional. So the kidneys will keep seeing high salt, they'll become desensitized to high salt, the blood volume will go up, the blood pressure will go up, and the kidneys will no longer be able to regulate that. So as long as you're within the normal regulation of the body, salt doesn't cause high blood pressure. It's just when you go outside of that bounds, probably because of a highly processed diet. And there's an argument for, but it's an interesting study that you mentioned, when people are eating a lot of sea salt, low processed sea salt, my bet is that they're also eating fewer ultra-processed foods because they're living in environments where they eat natural products more. So in those environments, the body regulates itself and salt isn't a problem. And it's not linked to high blood pressure in those environments.
What's interesting is with ultra-processed foods, which are you described as incredibly salty and full of sugar, they don't necessarily taste salty.
No, I don't understand that.
How is that happening?
I think they're just disguising them with so many other.
Well, probably the sugar as well,
It's
potentially.
the sugar. It's it's
Yeah.
adding loads of other things that, and sort of textural things, and playing with kind of your sort of mouthfeel of sensations of creaminess or whatever it might be. But I think this sort of touched on the point I was sort of making earlier about getting good salt into your food, so you're not having to add bad salt onto your food. And Josh will be able to talk much more about this. This is why, the best roast chickens are chickens that have been brined, because you're then getting salt deep into the meat, and so that you're not having to. I mean, a lot of people think that salt dries out meat. It can, but actually also you get to a point where it does the opposite. In that there's a brilliant book by Judy Rogers of the Zuni Cafe, fantastic cookbook, the Zuni Cafe cookbook, and she talks a lot about why they salt their meat very early. You don't want to salt your meat so early that you're curing it,
No.
but actually you do want to salt it to the point where you're drawing the moisture out, and actually a lot of cooking is about osmosis and diffusion ultimately. And what happens when you salt your meat early is that you do draw out the moisture, but because of osmosis and diffusion, what then happens is that this sort of water at the top absorbs the salt and then it goes back into the meat. So you get reverse diffusion and reverse osmosis. So it's really interesting, because the best food, I think, is always food that is, as I said, salted as you go. But also, and this is the point we were sort of touching on earlier, a lot of the salt that you put in food, you throw away. So, when you make pasta, it's important to salt the water to get flavour into that pasta. But you're not consuming all of that salt. The salt is being thrown away. And we were talking about steaks earlier as well. It's important to salt that early, but then, a lot of that is you're not actually consuming it, but what you're doing is giving your food that dimension. Yeah.
Well, again, it's that magic time, isn't it? So you don't want to salt it. Again, it's going back to your point. You either salt it with plenty of time, or you salt it immediately before you cook it. So it's
Exactly.
a challenge what you're trying to do. Again, with that water molecule balance.
Yeah, so I think on what you talked about with the brine chicken is that if you make a brine, you can just do a standard brine, which is salt and water, or you can add some sugar as well. If we do it, we generally add aromatics as well. So you can pour in seasoned bay, orange, lemon, whatever you need. Big bunch of thyme, and then you're using that vehicle to drag all those flavours into the chicken. But it's exactly what you said. Osmosis takes place, and all of that brine gets sucked in. But the longer you leave it there, that osmosis will reverse, and it will eventually start to dry out. So it's about understanding the size of your chicken and the timings and how that works.
And the sinew side as well, because it starts breaking down sinew and other elements as well.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Those benefits.
I mean, the one drawback is you don't really get very crispy skin on a brine chicken, I'd say that. But so it's about how you balance. Sometimes you can brine them, get all the aromatics in it, and then dry them in the fridge for another day if you've got the time. And then so you always start to work on how you can make these things better. But again, with cooking, in professional kitchens and kitchens at home, with technology changing and getting better all the time, I do think that sometimes it incites the way. It changes the way we cook and how we think about things, and I 100% agree with, seasoning pasta and seasoning potatoes, because they're starch-based and they suck in that salt, and that's important. Vegetables, I've almost recently started to change my opinion a little bit and say, well, actually, if we just steam all the veg at the start, if you're at home or in a restaurant, and then we get seasoning ready at the end, to getting it right in those dressings. Because what I've noticed from a professional kitchen point of view is that, and we don't do this anymore, but it used to happen, is that all your prep, you were using the table salt or the manufactured salt, and I'm like, well, actually, what I want to do for across our restaurants is take that away and only use actually your salt, Cornish sea salt. It costs us quite a bit, but
Reasonably priced.
and season all of the food with a natural product that we understand, because your salt has a unique flavour profile, and you need to adjust what you're doing and the way you cook on that. So simple dressings or simple vegetables, we will just dressings at the end. But that's based on the technology of having really nice steaming equipment.
And the point I was going to make is you can actually use less of a good salt, you can use less of it. To
Yes.
get the same effect. So we work, we have a spectrum of different sort of customer profiles, including large manufacturers who will take our products. They'll either do it because they want to be associated with Cornish sea salt, or they'll do it because actually they're trying to reduce the salt content of their food. So, for example, Marks & Spencer's use Cornish sea salt, and they're able to cut down the salt content in a product by 30%, but maintain a very similar flavour profile.
Really, did they use that across the board?
Not across the board.
No, but for certain products.
So
That's really interesting.
Yeah, we work with almost all the sort of big supermarket manufacturers, and we were even in things like Aunt Bessie's, Yorkshire puddings and things like that. So we have a.
That's positive.
It's interesting. Yeah, we have another product called Tech Salt, which is another conversation, but it's an interesting one, which is a mineralised salt. But because you have that different flavour profile, you've got the different ions going on with the flavour, you can actually cut your salt content down. Now, when you're cooking at home or when you're cooking in a kitchen, you're probably going to maximise the amount of salt you're going to do. But actually, if you were really, really thinking about it and you were really concerned about salt, using a really good sea salt has a more intense or flavour profile that side. You can reduce it down. So that's another tip. But we rarely do that in the kitchen too. So you just
well, I don't know. I think this is what's incited this conversation. As I said at the start, when I'm in the cookery school, it's not a simple question, but it feels like simple to start. What salt should I use, or which oil should? And that's the next chat. Which fats should I use to be cooking my vegetables or my steak or my meat? And debunking fats is again those two questions are like the biggest up there of how to understand what's the correct thing to use.
And again, I think if you went into, obviously professional kitchen is different, but if you went into a domestic kitchen in, say, the Mediterranean area, they would have different salts. So they wouldn't have one salt which does everything, whether it be hard texturally or different minerally or whatever it may be. They would have a different approach, because the sense that goes back to, if you think of salt as being the amplifier flavour, you can either have and I'm not knocking Bush as a brand, but you can either have that sort of Bush amplifier, or you can have a Bang & Olufsen. And the Bang & Olufsen amplifier gives you different detail. There's we've all done it, haven't you? You've been driving on somebody else's car and you suddenly hear a piece of music. I've never heard that note before. There's jingly bits on that side. And that's, in a sense, what the really good salts do. It allows you to hear those little jingly bits in different areas.
I mean, talking about jingly bits, I think for me, there's just an immense pleasurable joy in adding a finishing salt to something. And I love, a chocolate tart with just a sprinkle of flake sea salt at the end.
That's about texture for me as well.
Exactly. The other thing that I love is I love smoked salt. A very delicious burrata with some olive oil and just a little bit of smoked salt is just extraordinary. And chili salts and herb salts and things like that. They're really exciting ways of actually using a good sea salt that's has a flavour enhancement. Smoked salt in particular, and chili salts and rosemary salt. Chips with rosemary salt is just sublime. And I think it's a really fun way of exploring and playing with flavour and adding that whole.
I've been working on, as you're just making me think there, thank you. So we've been working on, we quite got there. I want to season the chips so at the pony, this is not in salt malt. I want to season our chips with a potato salt. So we've tried quite a lot over the years, but essentially if you're going to make a gnocchi, you rub the outside with salt and you bake the potatoes, scoop the centre out and make your gnocchi dough. The skins are, for me, the best bit. They're absolutely delicious, and they're kind of dehydrated. They represent the minerality content that's in the skin, and then the salt enhances that. So I've been trying to dry those potato skins and turn it into a potato salt to season the chips. I've not got. I'll let you know when I get it sorted, but because when we dry it and cook it, it can become incredibly hard. Sometimes it's like, oh, we've done it, and then you do it the next, and you end up breaking your teeth on it. So.
Going back to smoked salts as well, the other thing is to look at the smoked salts is there's a lot of chemical smoked salts out there. So when you're looking at smoked salts, it's really important. It's very hard to know whether it's a chemical compound in there. They should declare it. There are, again, I totally agree with you. In my kitchen, I have fine flake, which is I think is the most practical product out there. So it's the little broken shards, because it sort of disperses everything, and the smoked salt. We smoke with oak, apple, and cherry, and there's a little bit of, and the oak is a bit like a robusta.
Right.
So you have the green oak comes through, but the apple and the cherry, and it's one of those things when you open the tub up and smell it. But what I think with a smoked salt, also you want to make sure is that when you taste it, it also tastes the smoke, because you can get the aroma, there's very strong aromas, but actually often they don't have the flavour, and so when you're using a smoked salt, make sure it has that smoky flavour. And again, on fish, there's so many things it works on. It's brilliant.
Can you touch on what rock salt is?
Yeah, so rock salt. So basically, it's all the same. If you like, it's a bit like chicken and egg, which came first. So, but there isn't actually an answer to this one. So it's not quite like chicken and egg. So it goes back to rock salt are ancient seas which are evaporated off. So Jurassic oceans, which are or earlier, which have been evaporated off. The salts have effectively deposited down onto the bottom of the seabed. So the Dead Sea is a good example of things we know about now. Well, that's all magnesium now because all the sodium's gone. But so the sea's gone over tectonic movement, glacial bits and pieces, a whole range of things. Basically, that seam of sea salt has been crushed and squashed, so it becomes effectively a rock layer. So it's incredibly hard. Now, it can have rock salts are interesting in that they they have a textural potential benefit because if you want something really crunchy and hard. But from a point of view of actually using it as a flavour enhancer, it's a bit more of a challenge unless you get it very, very fine. The reason being is because it's been underground for 60 million years, it's really bloody hard.
It is so hard.
I think I remember we've had a complaint before where somebody said we found a bit of glass in your sea salt. And we said, okay, so we got the sample back through. And it turned out that this lady actually in her salt pig used to have rock salt in there. And we put it in. It took 15 minutes of boiling down, but we realised it was sea salt. Now, it goes back to what you're trying to do when you're consuming salt is you're trying to break those ionic bonds as fast as possible. So the issue with sea salt is because it's so dense, when you eat it, effectively very little of the salt actually dissolves on your tongue to give you those electrical pathways for flavour. Most of it goes into your stomach and dissolves there. So the potential to over-consume a rock salt is bad. Now, rock salts are the other issue with rock salt. It's really hard. The other issue is because of the way that salts are laid down in seas, they're sort of stratified. So, and when we talked about pink Himalayan salt earlier on, which is a bit of a fad. I think
I've got a question on this one here. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was a bit of a fad. So the pink. So does anybody know why it's pink?
Barbie.
Hey? Barbie. That's right. It was Barbie. Barbie made it. No, it's because it's got iron oxide. So it's basically got rust in it. That's what makes it pink. So it's got a non-salt exclusion. Most of the salts you'll see. So salts are either white, opaque in nature. If you have grease salts, it's because it's got clay in it. If you have other bits and pieces. So contaminants, and I say contaminants without saying they're necessarily negative, but they are contaminants on that side. So the reason, again, so the question is pink Himalayan salt significantly different to a good sea salt? Yes and no, it depends where you take it from. So the problem is, I was just talking about, basically you have a stratification of salts coming through. 85% of it will be pure sodium chloride. So what I tend to do is, because I'm a nerd, I will take salts and I'll find them and I'll take them to the lab and we use mass spectrometry to actually understand what that salt's made up of. And the pink Himalayan salts of the samples I've tested are basically close to 99% pure sodium chloride. They have lots of claims on the outside, but actually they're mostly sodium chloride. And that's right. Now they have some interesting uses, particularly in things like butchery, where you're after, in a sense, a low-cost wall of salt to actually effectively to dehydrate and to keep the meat from going off, because the other thing is
it's to aid the dehydration, but again, debunking some of that's just one factor in aging meat. But everything's we build a Himalayan salt wall, the meat's going to be amazing. Not really, there's lots of other factors you need to get right, but again, I think people are just attracted to Himalayan salt.
It looks nice.
It looks nice,
We've been approached. We do some. We don't actually not currently, but we do private label supermarket business over in Scandi markets, and they came to us and said, "Can you tub us a pink Himalayan salt of this grade?" The problem we had is we couldn't get something which is called SEDEX approved. So SEDEX is basically ethical trading approved, because the amount of people who are killed in the mines every year makes it incredibly hard to get somebody to come in and say, yes, that's an ethical way of, you've killed 20 people at that mine this year because the health and safety wasn't good enough. So I would say there's nothing necessarily wrong with pink Himalayan salt, apart from it may not be the most ethical product from the point of view of humanity in the way it's produced. But again, there will be other, again, like anything, there'll be mines which are improving their practices, and so it will change. But yeah, it's just a very, very hard sea salt.
Oh, right. Yeah. So we're getting to questions now.
Yeah.
I think we were going to. Thank you. We were going to touch on a bit of history as well, history of salt, but maybe we could do that at the end. And so I might
Choose. I know.
All right.
That's exciting.
So I might quickly do this one, and then maybe you could do this one.
Yeah.
So this one says how to cook for those who are high salt tolerance and those who don't. So simply put, if you're cooking for yourself at home, knowing yourself and knowing the people that you're cooking for. So if you're a couple at home, knowing your partner. The way we learn how to cook in restaurants or in kitchens is through repetitiveness, So continuing to do something over and over and over, you start to see small changes or start to notice small factors within what you're cooking, and you start to understand it inside and out. And I think having a good product to start with is key to that. Whether it's Cornish sea salt or a different excellent salt that's produced in this country. Actually, one of the other things I was keen to achieve for the festival, but we've got years to come, was actually a salt tasting room of all the sort of artisan salts that exist within the country. But you never know, so maybe we could talk about that.
Well, somebody really nicely sent me a sort of like a Christmas calendar once with all these different salts on it. It is fascinating.
Yeah, I'd love to see that.
Different flavours.
Yeah, it'd be amazing. Imagine getting them all in the room. Yeah. But so knowing yourself really, and again, you have your tongue. You know whether there's high salt in something or not. So starting with a good product, but also going back to what we were saying is season as you go along, sparingly, and just taste a little bit more and just taste. And it's just building those factors up. And I also think you really also need to be aware of products with high salt content that are delicious, that are good for you, things like Parmesan, anchovies. Similarly, I also love to cook with, actually, and I think it's an associated business of yours, is the Cornish seaweed. Yeah. So Cornish seaweed, we will always cook our mussels at the pony, for example, and salt and malt for that matter, with with a garlic butter that we make with your Cornish seaweed mixed salad, because it just has umami flavour, has natural salt. It's come out of the sea. You're cooking mussels in the sea, so it's just about learning. I always say there's about 5 or 6 products you just keep in your cupboard when you can cook anything you want, and that's, it's a decent salt, it's a decent pepper, it's Cornish seaweed, it's Lee and Perrins, and maybe a good soy sauce, and you could cook anything then, make anything taste delicious. Oh, and obviously a great olive oil.
So there were 2 questions. Both of them I thought were sort of interesting. So the first was what Josh was just talking about for people with different genetic variations in salt tolerance. I think that this diet that we often have of ultra-processed foods early in life, it dysregulates the system. And actually, I think you're exactly right. When the system is allowed, like when you're cooking and you're tasting and as you're going through, the body is really, really good at regulating itself. I mean, there's 2 things. So first of all, we all life on Earth evolved in the sea. Like, we evolved in a very, very high salt environment. We're used to high salt. Our cells depend on high salt, and we're good at regulating that. And the other thing is that we have mechanisms in the brain to make us seek out salt. So we crave it. We have a dopamine rush when we get it. So salt is a very rewarding thing to have. And again, that is normally balanced in a balanced diet. We seek salty food until we have the amount of salt we need, and then we don't crave salty food anymore. And that's pretty much true for all of these macronutrients. Then the other question was, why does my brain feel it comes alive when I eat salt? And I think it's really interesting. We do associate salt with a kind of invigorating thing. It's not soporific, it doesn't make us drowsy, it's not like relaxing, it's a very enlivening flavor, right? And I think that, I mean, probably many reasons for that, but one of the reasons is exactly this thing that we get a big reward, a dopamine rush in the brain when we have salt. So that's very awakening and enlivening. And the second thing is because salt it directly activates neurons. The sodium and the chlorine both activate the neurons directly. It's very, very activating. It's very alerting to the brain, as opposed to, let's say, alcohol. So alcohol is directly, it depresses neural activity. Right. So there's a reason that alcohol is very relaxing. I mean, initially you drink alcohol and it makes you, happy and possibly enlivening. That's because of this disinhibitory effect. But then after that, it makes you drowsy. Yeah. The salt kind of goes on, it's very enlivening. And I would say my guess is biologically because of that direct action of sodium and chlorine on the the neurons in the tongue and the neurons in the brain.
So what makes the salted rim on a margarita so good?
Yeah.
a celery salt in a Bloody Mary, and actually a salted gin and tonic is delicious.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That changing of the flavor
Yeah.
profile, and the salted rim is really interesting because it doesn't work if you mix the salt into the margarita. It's not nice. But that very, very enlivening texture and the salt, and it's almost, when you first have a sip of that margarita, it's right on the edge of unpleasant.
Yeah.
It's
so salty.
it's just waking you up.
It's just waking you
Preparing
up.
you. So, all right, I'm going to
It's
have it.
exactly it.
Yeah.
It's exactly it.
I mean, going back to the point you made earlier on, one of the things I like to explain to people is that the mineral profile of your body exactly matches the mineral profile of the sea.
Yeah.
So it's one of the things that gives Darwin a big tick,
Yes.
and all life forms come out of the effect of the sea because the mineral profile exactly matches it. So if you think about depleting, they're all coming this way, aren't they? If you think
Right, we've got a lot of questions.
When you effectively, going back to salts get depleted in your body as well. So as you use them, they go. So you need to bring them back in again. So it's really important to have them back in the right proportions to refill those differential charges. I mean, they're charged particles. They're sort of almost like an enzyme in a way of thinking about. They create change in bits. Quite a few questions here.
Just on that, there's a really beautiful quote by the American writer Helen Keller, which is something along the lines of salt is the cure to all ailments, either sweat, tears, or the sea. And I really like that.
Yeah, that's good.
Very nice.
What is equivalent to a teaspoon of table salt against a sort of quality flake salt? So I always hate recipes where if I don't follow recipes, but I do, where it says a teaspoon or something, because you need grammage or something that side. But the basic answer is simply the bulk density of a good flake salt is probably about half that of table salt. So if you had effectively a flat spoon of table salt, if you had, in a sense, a nice domed or 2 flat spoons of flake salt, you're probably going to be there or thereabouts. The other way of looking at it is if you were to, going back to my point earlier on, unless it has a functional need, so for example, if you're bread manufacturing where you're trying to obviously get the sort of gluten reaction or you're trying to preserve something, I do a lot of smoking at home, but if you're trying to preserve something, then you obviously need that quantity, particularly like the chlorides as well, because the chlorides obviously from the point of view of protecting cells.
Yep.
But but you could, depending on the recipe, cut it down by, I suggest, up to 30%. So reduce the amount of salt down. So if you've got a recipe that says table salt and it's not there for a function, it's there from a flavour point of view, you could cut it down by about 30%.
We have an interesting question about how does the effect of salt differ from that of MSG? Now, I'm not a scientist, but as I understand it, MSG is glutamate, which is pure umami, and salt amplifies the effects of umami, which is why Pringles, you can't just have one. It's just because Pringles are just MSG and salt and a bit of potato flakes, I think. So they are different, but although it's monosodium glutamate, so I don't know why.
It was originally derived from kombu.
Yes, it was from seaweed.
From seaweed, yeah.
But they are different. So MSG is pure umami, and then salt is salt. So it is activating different receptors, but the salt amplifies the umami.
So next question, does bleaching the salt change the flavour chemistry? Is this a bit like people wanting white bread for appearance? It's bleached because often it's come from sort of salt beds which are sort of probably brown or black, so they've got lots of contaminants in them. And so by bleaching them, you effectively make it, you change, it's like anything, isn't it? Goes back to the point, yes, white is what we associate with salt.
Association.
So actually, association, so you want white salt.
What do they bleach it with?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not sure actually.
No.
Not sure what they do.
Yeah.
But it's,
Yeah,
I'll write that down for later on.
Yeah.
Next year's talk, we'll go through that side. But I'm not sure they added, but they put it purely for appearance. Does it change? It obviously changes the chemistry because it adds other compounds in. There could be arsenic, it could be other bits and pieces which may well be in those sites. So it changes the compounds in the products. It will change the flavour, but all bleached salts I'm aware of are almost always processed salts which have had the other minerals stripped out. So they'll be almost pure sodium chloride. So they won't, going back to the conversation, is what I would call bad salt. So if it's been bleached, it's probably because it's bad salt. Natural sea salts will be white or opaque. They won't have those areas as long as they haven't been laid down. For example, the French gris salt is laid down on clay beds.
Yeah.
So the clay comes up through and I'll use the term contaminates the salt, not necessarily an issue because actually you may like the benefits of those particular flavours. So I would say that bleached salt 99% of the time is a highly processed salt. but has other chemicals added to it, which is not what you want from a food point of view. So it's not positive that side. Could you give me one sentence to encourage friends who are still using table salt to convert to a better one? I think this is, flavour and health.
Yeah,
It's
flavour
the
and
two
health.
things. And that's the
And I
two.
always say the table salt, don't throw it away, just use it to scrub your frying pans. That usually helps as well, I think, because they're like, oh, it must be really shit.
And I think, Josh, question for you. When you steam veg, do you use salt to amplify the flavour?
No, so we don't. We just, if you're steaming vegetables, I find the best way to transfer flavour is afterwards. Simply put, if you're going to steam some broccoli in a separate pan, you would have some butter, some very good salt, some lemon rind, a little bit of lemon juice. You warm that up, you get all your flavour intense in there. It could be an anchovy as well, whatever, and then you dress your vegetables with that afterwards. And I think that is a nice, cleaner way of doing it. However, if you're cooking vegetables differently, like if you're going to cook spinach and braise spinach, then I would be cooking the butter in a pan and adding salt to that and putting the spinach in there and cooking it out. And interestingly on things like that is that sometimes we did start to get a little bit obsessed with allowing vegetables to be, especially in restaurant kitchens, they have to be bright green and they have to look vibrant because there's, again, that association of things looking fresh and clean. And it's taken me a long time to realise that actually that's just, a large box of spinach, not the small leaf spinach that's for salads really. Take your time to cook it, get that flavour built into it, add the salt at the start, continue to cook it, allowing that water to evaporate, taste it again, add some more salt, and you're doing braised spinach. And yes, it is going to be dark green and look like it came out of Popeye's can, but that's what we call it in the kitchen. We call it Popeye spinach, but it tastes bloody delicious. So every product's different, and it's about understanding how you can apply the techniques that you're teaching yourself to those products, really.
Josh, could they keep less time when you pre-cook salted vegetables, like, as opposed to unsalted vegetables that have just been steamed? They last less long.
Less long?
Yeah, because if you've blanched vegetables,
Yeah.
salted, I find they keep quite a long time, whereas if you just steam them and they're unsalted, right?
I think if you just steam them and you're not using salt, and they will keep a little bit longer, yeah. But the target is to really kind of, you get your prep done for the day, and then you're not keeping anything for too long. But I know what you mean. I would say that eventually, if it's something delicate, salt will have a detrimental effect on that product, yeah. But it is also a preserver, so it's about balancing
balance,
it.
Isn't it? Yeah, so
Yeah.
it drags the water out. So basically, if you've got too much salt on the outside of the vegetable, and you've got a vegetable you want to see nice and crisp. If you allow salt to be there, it will effectively, cellularly, it will start to break down.
Yeah,
So
it's like if you're going to pickle onions, you can. I'm trying to remember which way it is round now. So, but I think I learnt this off of a local. We were pickled shallots or pickled onions, and we'd make a pickling solution with Bristol sherry cream. Actually, it was an old recipe. It was really delicious. But the way you peel your onions or your shallots, the way you salt them. If you dry salt them or if you put it into a wet brine, has a dramatic effect on how crispy that onion is retained once it's pickled. It's really interesting because they're like, oh, my onions are soggy, they're not very nice. Or when you have a pickled onion, you want it to be delicious and sweet and crunchy, but pretty sure it needs to be a dry salt. So you toss and then you pull the water off. If you put it into a brine as such, it becomes soggy. So it's about.
We touched on this earlier, the importance of salt in preserving and
Yeah, we got one here. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Right.
Yeah, but
and it's sort of fundamental in sort of preserving, and historically it's been the way that food was preserved because it draws out all of that water, and the reason that food spoils is because of the water content. So
yes,
it is instrumental. I'm of Punjabi heritage, and all of the pickles and ferments and things. If you're going to make, one of the things that I grew up eating was mango pickles and carrot pickles, and actually the first thing that you do is you air dry your salted carrots to get out all of that water, and it preserves them.
Okay.
So it's been, historically it's such an important. It's been, for survival really.
Arguably, it's what created society. So,
Yeah.
well, modern society, if you like. So hunter-gatherers who didn't have access to salt, obviously ate because they couldn't preserve. Once we started preserving things, then we could farm them. We could then produce more of them. We could then start trading.
And it became a currency.
So yeah, paid in salt. Roman soldiers paid in salt. So salary comes from saline. Again, that same sort of comment. The most highly taxed product in there. I mean, the nice. I don't know if anybody see what was the program based in Cornwall on the cliffs and the smugglers and the recently. Poldark, thank you. So Poldark, yeah, I never remember that name. Poldark, actually, the smuggling which went on in Cornwall, they talk about rum, but actually mostly was salt. So because the French basically the government were taxing salt at a huge rate. Now the Cornish always hated the English anyway, but they were taxing large areas. So the amount of salt that was brought over, because the pilchard industry was huge.
You touched on earlier with one of my fun facts is that salt historically was was currency. And the word salary comes from salt. Sal is salt.
That's amazing.
I've heard families talk about the ketogenic diet, but very little about salt. Can you explain a little bit about how those with epilepsy should increase or decrease salt in their diet? Interesting. So the ketogenic diet, which may come up later today as well, it's because it's used in weight loss as well, but it's very, very important in controlling seizures, particularly in children. The idea with the ketogenic diet is to regulate the availability of glucose because the brain is very, very dependent on sugar. And so one way to limit seizure activity, so a seizure is hyperactivity of the brain, uncontrolled hyperactivity of the brain. So one way to limit that is if you just limit sugar, then there will be the brain will have less ability to have a seizure. So that's kind of the theory behind the ketogenic diet. So salt is a completely separate thing. The main way I would think, and generally when we treat patients with epilepsy, we don't really worry about salt. But if someone with epilepsy asked me, what should I do about salt? My worry would be low salt. So hyponatremia, like we said, when you're doing drugs that prevent you from excreting water, or you're drinking, in order to get hyponatremia from drinking water, you really would have to drink a lot of water. But there are people who do it, people who exercise, and then they start drinking gallons and gallons very quickly. You can overcome your body's natural, if you start ignoring your body's natural thirst, you can put yourself into these states. So hyponatremia for someone with epilepsy would be really dangerous because that increases seizures in everybody. But that's the only thing I think I would say about epilepsy and salt. The danger would be having too little salt.
Yeah. You get when we have, I think some of the issues with some of the government messaging about reducing salt down is again the amount of respiratory diseases in the elderly. And effectively what they're having is they're not, because chlorides, effectively, I mean, Donald Trump, who I'm sure everybody's very keen on this, talked about drinking bleach to get rid of COVID-19.
And injecting it.
Yeah, injecting it. Unfortunately, there's sort of a slight element of truth in that, which is you need the chlorides, the chlorine in your blood to fight infections, sort of both bacterial and viruses within the cell. So it's really important to have those chlorides in your diet so you can actually fight infection. So if you have an infected area, if you were then to do a scan of that, you'd find it's been flooded with chlorides. So the body's doing that because what happens, it goes through the cell, it splits into chlorine particles and kills off the viruses within the cells. So all these people who've been heeding the messages of don't have any salt are then getting pneumonia.
Right.
Because again, the bronchial diseases aren't being challenged because they haven't got enough salt in the diets to be able to do it. So,
and by the way, a really good sort of lay treatment for pneumonia is salt inhalation. Right. So salt water, like salt vapor inhalation, is really good for clearing out lung disease.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it's an old technique in India. That's what they do a lot of times in these villages. They just do salts like. When you put a hot like a steam inhalation, if you put salt in that water, that's very good for treating lung disease.
If people, when they get back, have a look up the Elvis study, which was a study which was done by an Indian doctor up in Edinburgh, looking at using salt as a natural way of reducing down basically bronchial diseases, particularly the common cold. They happened to use Cornish sea salt as their control, which was really interesting because it reduced colds down by 3 days, compared with not using a salt from that side. But look up the Elvis study because it's really interesting. So from a point of view, the studies continue. It's been published in The Lancet in 2019, but it's looking at the effects of things like asthma on young children, reducing the common cold. Obviously, it kills COVID. It was one of the bits and pieces. The World Health Organization said don't take salt that side, which they then redacted 12 months later. I think maybe they're paid for by drugs companies. But again, it was an interesting thing. But so salt has so many different functions in the body. It's fascinating.
There's an interesting question about the sort of salt-bitter relationship. Do other flavours behave in this dynamic? Is it sort of like a complementary, antagonistic sort of relationship? So I know that salt definitely reduces the effects of the astringency of bitterness. It amplifies umami. It sort of amplifies sweetness. I don't know if there's a sort of a necessary a hierarchy, but I think that whole idea of salt adds that dimension. I mean, there's a brilliant series of books called The Flavor Thesaurus by Nikki Signet, which I hugely recommend. I would think of it more as a sort of amplifier, although it is specifically with bitterness that it has this effect of reducing that astringency.
Yeah, I think that's right too. I'm not aware of any other relationship which is diametrically opposed like that. But generally speaking, salt is the only component that amplifies basically all flavors that we like. Yeah. Sugar doesn't do that. Fat works in an interesting way that it helps certain molecules reach receptors in the tongue.
Look, fat's the best carrier of flavor.
It's the carrier.
Yes.
But it's not specifically a flavor amplifier. It sort of makes flavors more effectively reach the neurons in the tongue.
I've got one here, which is how do you go about debunking the myth in the media that salt is evil? This is a real challenging one because you effectively have government departments which are, if we like the salt police, not quite like China where they have a ministry of salt, but it's you have the salt police. So I mean, if, for example, they'll have so the natural balance of salts will be, if you like, around about 1.5 to 2% of magnesium, potassium, calcium, roughly speaking. But to be able to talk about having those elements in there have to be at least 20%. So even though they're in the natural form which your body needs, the government's decided that actually you can't talk about these being healthier salts because they're not in their prescribed amounts as being a supplement. Basically, they're looking for a supplementary benefit from that side. So it's really tricky for us. I mean, from day one, we've always talked about healthier salts. But we've had a couple of sort of slight scrapes with the salt police coming up through saying, you shouldn't really be talking about this. And you send them the evidence and they say, yes, but if you look at prescribed levels of this, and this, it doesn't fit. And say, no, I agree with that one, but that's not what your body needs. So it's an interesting one. I think we just keep messaging. I think we do get told, we get customers phoning us up or emailing us and saying, our doctor has told us that actually we should be having sea salts in our diet rather than cut out the table salt, sea salt. So there is an understanding in the medical profession that a highly mineralised or a mineralised salt is better than just a pure sodium chloride. But yeah, how do you... I think it's going to take time.
I think that leads into a question that's here. It says, what policies would you like to see enacted to keep people informed?
I think for me, I don't think we actually should quieten the media talking about the bad impact of salt and ultra-processed food. For me, this question is about the question of ultra-processed food.
They are massive things.
Exactly, and actually I think that noise should continue. I think for me, what we need to get back to is home cooking.
When you talk about ultra-processed foods that we know is bad, we know it's not good, and pure sodium chloride is not good, and you can buy good table sea salts that are a lot better for you. But I think it's about trying to have a conversation to say salt is required for your diet. It's delicious. It enhances your food. It's good for you. But continuing that conversation about ultra-processed food is extremely bad for you. Because at the moment it feels like it's a bit one-sided. It's just like ultra-processed food's full of salt. Salt's bad.
We find, I mean, from a sales point of view, we will find as a natural sea salt producer, our sales will go up if there's some real negativity about salt, because people will start to look at it and they'll start to think about what salts they're actually going to intake into their diets. So it's an interesting one.
I think there's an interesting difference between the taste of salt, like saltiness, and the amount of salt. And they don't always I mean, like the example that you gave earlier of salting pasta water is a really great example. You can use really what looks like a ridiculous amount of salt in pasta water. The pasta is not going to taste that salty.
Yeah, exactly.
Just one thing's worth saying, almost like a quick identification of the salts you're buying, because it goes back to, you can have highly processed sea salts and highly processed table salts, which tend to be from rock salts and processed that side. If you look at a salt and it's a cube, it is a sodium chloride cube. The likelihood is it's highly processed, whether it's a sea salt or table salt. So you can buy, I won't name brands, but there'll be major brands in supermarkets, and chemically they are identical. The table salt and the sea salt is exactly the same. And you occasionally get some really good Daily Mail reporting saying we've just taken sacks of table salt and sacks of sea salt, and they're nearly identical. Sea salts are con. I agree with you. that is salt, because there's not sort of like an application to control to salt.
Yeah.
Actually, that side. So if you look at a salt,
That's crazy. It's probably the oldest ingredient in the world.
yeah, what's it? But if you look at a salt and it's a regular cube, it's probably going to be highly processed. If you look at a salt and it's got lots of different shapes and may have some sulfate crystals in it, may have bits and pieces, then the likelihood is that it's been produced in a natural brine. Hopefully they haven't washed it. You can't tell, but hopefully they haven't washed it, and it's in those areas there. But a cube of anything tends to be a sodium chloride cube if you buy it. So chloride's always bonded to a cube, so it's likely to be a sodium chloride cube, so it's likely to be highly processed. So if you pick up, well, I buy sea salt, and you pick up your sea salt and you tip it out, and it's a nice cuboid product, it's probably a highly processed sea salt. So all the things we've been talking about doesn't count.
So I think we're getting to an end, a natural end, hopefully. Any more questions? We had a lot of questions. Oh, we got one right up at the top there.
So just two questions. One is for Phil. Are you seeing the impact, are you feeling the impact on your business of microplastics coming through from the ocean?
We do test and we haven't seen it. So we do filter down. So we have a sort of, it's a bit like the definition of what a microplastic is, but when we've looked, we haven't seen it. We filter down to 10 microns, so 100th of a millimetre coming through for the seawater that comes out that side. Now, we haven't actually tested, if you like, what probably a good thing to do when I get back, haven't tested the filters to see whether the filters are picking up those microplastics and when they're not coming through. But it's obviously it's a concern, for any sea salt producers, and you could argue that maybe the benefit of the Himalayan salt, if we're worried about microplastic, is very unlikely that 70 million years ago there was many microplastics around. So you could argue that could be a benefit. But from us, we have a highly controlled process. So if you're buying, let's say lots of Mediterranean salts or the Atlantic salts or these Celtic salts, they're just taking the seawater straight in, without filtration, and whatever, going back to your point earlier on, whatever's in the water, it could be flamingo poo, whatever it is actually going to be sitting on the salt afterwards. Our process goes through a whole series of filtration to remove anything which isn't charged particles. So effectively, we don't pull. We have another, it gets slightly more complicated. We have another process which effectively got magnets which pull the charged particles out. So plastics aren't charged, so they won't come through. So I can't say it couldn't happen, but we've not seen it to date. We keep monitoring it.
You have one more?
And then for Ash, you talked about sort of high blood pressure not necessarily being linked to salt. What's the worst impact of not controlling salt from a brain perspective? What do you see as the outcomes of that?
Death.
What's the worst impact of not controlling salt?
Yeah.
You mean too much or too little?
Yeah, exactly. On the brain specifically.
Yeah, probably death. No, which is actually really true. So salt matters. The time it matters the most, where tiny changes of salt could lead to life and death, is in traumatic brain injury. So if someone has a car accident, they're in the ICU, they're in the trauma unit, we are monitoring their salt so closely because salt goes along with water and salt goes along with swelling. So when the brain is already swelling, if you drop the salt too low, the brain will start to swell extremely quickly, and in the skull, there's not much room for the brain to swell. So that would cause immediate death. And then on the other hand, if the salt gets too high, then it will sort of dehydrate the brain. You'll lose all that water, and again, then you won't have blood flow. And so when the brain is very, very fragile, the amount of salt is really critical. I mean, tiny differences are really critical. Then outside of that, I would say the worst thing that can happen if you have too little salt, you would end up in the emergency room, and the worry would be seizure, or possibly coma, but probably seizure.
And confusion beforehand.
Confusion before seizure. Absolutely. So confusion before seizure. So when people are doing recreational drugs or drinking or something like that, if there starts to be a kind of confusion that's hard to explain, that would be the first sign that salt is too low.
Do we have one more? I think something.
You talked a bit about building a tolerance to salt and people starting to put more and more salt on their food, and the kidney's role in that. But I wondered how our brain affects how we perceive the saltiness of food.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and it's one of the interesting things about storytelling in food, that if we can tell stories where we set a narrative structure that amplifies the flavor of salt.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important because that reduces the total amount of salt that we need, but it amplifies the saltiness of the food.
So
and on the other hand,
it's based on your perception.
it's based on your perception. So and that's why sometimes in these processed foods, they're adding a lot of salt to foods where there's not a story of saltiness. So then you need a lot of salt in that
Yeah.
because the person's not expecting a salty
That's
flavor.
maybe why it doesn't taste that salty.
And it doesn't taste that
Yeah,
salty.
yeah.
But if you're expecting, like if you buy a bar of chocolate and it says this is a dark chocolate with sea salt on top, and you see those salt crystals on top, that can taste really, really salty with extremely little salt in that. First of all, that's storytelling about salt. But secondly, there is a biological adaptation. If you keep having very, very, very high salt, but not tasting saltiness, your taste receptors will downregulate to that. And then you need more salt to have that perception of saltiness. But I think the narrative that we tell around food has a lot to do with like the nutritional content.
Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking, because earlier I was thinking my wife is a really keen gardener. And actually, she's when she's grown potatoes, she gets really excited about digging potatoes out of the dirt, and she just really likes getting the dirt on her hands. And she has this experience when she eats that potato. I mean, I already have it because she tells me the story, right? She's like, oh, I grew this thing, and I was out there, and I'm watching her, and she's got dirt all over her fingernails, and the potatoes are really good.
Yeah.
But the experience she is having
Yeah.
is probably unbelievable.
Yeah.
Because she has been out there on her hands, and he's doing it, and then she eats
exactly.
it, and it's probably just absolutely overwhelming.
I think there was a statistic somewhere. I think it was something like, this is a bit like the Guinness said, but it's like 78% of it is a physical chemical compound, and there's the emotional side after that. So you get those
It's
two
so
elements.
important.
Yeah.
I think we're going to do a salt tasting on the way out.
So yeah, people as they want to leave, if they want to come through, what we'll do is we're going to cut the tomatoes in half, and we'll have table salt. We're trying to be as scientific as possible. So table salt on one side, and Cornish sea salt on the other side, and it's really just to taste the difference because you so rarely do it. I remember when we first started, there's the Royal Cornwall Show, which is this big agricultural show done with us, and a farmer came up and he said, "What's this bloody rubbish about salt, boy? Salt is salt, isn't it?"
Yeah.
And he stood around for a long time, and the next year his wife came up. We did it the second year, and she said, "I don't know if you remember my husband from last year. He came and made a lot of fuss about salt. He won't eat anything else now."
Yeah.
and it was just once he tasted it, he couldn't come up and tell me, but she had to come back because he couldn't believe the difference.
So I think what's important, actually, I do this at the Pony quite a lot, the cookery school. You're doing your tomatoes, but to iterate the importance of salt and seasoning. So I generally, these are actually quite nice datery tomatoes, and they've probably warmed up, which is important as well. So I think salt and temperature are really, really, really important, and I tend to like to do this demonstration with what I call a shit tomato. So I take a standard shit tomato that you might get in a BLT and maybe Tesco's, and we have a slice of that really cold from the fridge, and it's not very nice. And then we take the next slice and we add salt, okay, and we wait for the tomato to warm up. And while the tomato is warming up to room temperature, the salts and acid, it penetrates, it's drawing the water content out, and you're almost seasoning that tomato with its own water content, which the salt is diluted. And the difference is immeasurable. And then from there, we would then maybe add some herbs and some olive oil. All the while, this is with a shit tomato, okay? So it's just thinking about those factors and about, if you're going to get an outstanding product or a tomato that we've grown in your greenhouse, or for example, the ones we're growing in the Polytunnel Pony this season were amazing, and just bringing it together with thinking about temperature, thinking about time of seasoning, using the correct amount of salt, and using a delicious olive oil or some herbs that you've grown, all those factors turn into something that can be absolutely delicious, but essentially it's just a slice of tomato with salt and herbs.
It goes back to it's an amplifier. It's an amplifier flavour. You either have a bush amplifier, or do you want to bang olives? That's
exactly.
So we're going to try the bang olives.
We'll try the bang
Great.
and
Right.
the bush.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time to come. It's really appreciated. And you guys, of course.
Thank you.